Welcome to the 2021 New York City Candidates Forum, brought to you as a public service by the Henry George School of Social Science. The shortage of housing and high rental costs are issues that many New Yorkers, especially millennials, are struggling with. How do you plan to address this problem?
First, we have to look at the reality and the situation that New York City finds itself currently. We have a 700,000 affordable housing shortfall in New York City. The only way that we're going to be able to solve this crisis is by building more. And when you look at my policy platform, I know that I'm the most substantive candidate in this particular race, especially when it comes to housing policy. So one of the first things we need to do is remove exclusionary zoning policies, especially in high opportunity areas. And one of the things I've been very vocal about is rezoning NoHo and Soho, because one, I believe that that's an area, well, it's not even, I believe, I know that based on statistics and facts, in the last decade, Soho has actually had a net loss in housing in the last decade. That means almost every single neighborhood, with the exception of Soho and I believe Park Slope, have actually built more. So we know that this is a supply and demand issue. And that means we have to open up almost every single neighborhood in New York City to ensure that we can meet this housing crisis that we find ourselves in. That is basically going to push prices down, and it's basically supply and demand. So one, let's make sure we remove ourselves of exclusionary zoning policies everywhere in New York so we can build more. Two, we have to encourage builders to ensure that they build affordable housing units. And the MIH program it was a great idea, number one, but in implementation of it has been faulty because they've only really focused on the working class and lower middle class neighborhoods, not necessarily the high opportunity areas like NoHo or Soho. So the one thing we need to do is build more, incentivize a lot of these developers to ensure that they are participating in the MIH program, because at the end of the day, it ends up being taxpayer neutral. And that's one thing that we can do. If you build MIH, assuming mandatory inclusionary housing, so you build a percentage of the units that a developer may create, it's going to be segmented off for affordable housing families. If we do that, then it's actually end up being revenue neutral for the city, and the tax benefits that a developer receives for building more ends up not costing the city anything, because we benefit, cost goes down. Now, additionally, what I call for is actually creating home ownership opportunities for middle-class families as well, and working-class families. One of the most successful programs in New York City history, I believe, was the Mitchell-Lama program. In the 1970s, it allowed 140,000 middle-class New Yorkers the ability to attain home ownership. So basically what it did, it allowed them to stay in the city, not get pushed out because of higher prices, and then they can raise a family and stay in the city that they love. So why call for a new Mitchell-Lama program and for middle-class New Yorkers, for couples that make $350,000 or less, so they can stay here, raise their families, and not get pushed out. Moreover, it's about increasing the opportunity for upward social mobility as well. And I know there are other questions, so I may be cross-referencing too many of these. So you know what? I'll stop there, because I'm pretty sure that some of the other positive policies are going to show up in some of the other questions. So let me just stop there.
Blighted and vacant parcels dot New York City, especially in the outer boroughs. What strategies do you support to put them back into productive use for both families and commerce?
Absolutely. That's an excellent question. It's actually part of my small business and economic plan. There was an idea that I read about over a year ago, and it was a nonprofit that was created in Boston that ended up being exported to other cities like New Orleans. And it was called, and the nonprofit, kind of the name is not as important, but the idea is, and they call it transforming empty storefronts into social infrastructure. What does that mean? Basically, what it means is that a nonprofit that focusing on some sort of community aspect, like let's say a cafe or a library, or even like a small concert space, whatever it may be, they make a deal with the landlord where they pay for all electricity costs, water bills, whatever. The nonprofit covers all that, but they don't pay for rent. And what they do is that transform the empty storefront into this community space where all of a sudden if hopefully, which we actually have seen, and we've seen evidence of this, where they've increased foot traffic to the actual empty storefront because it's a community space. And then what it allows a landlord to do is to market it to prospective tenants. So all of a sudden you'll see a prospective business owner or whatever, they look at that space, they're like, wow, there's so much foot activity here, so much foot traffic. This would be absolutely incredible space for me to actually operate in. So because of this nonprofit doing this, it ends up being like a twofold benefit. One, they're not really paying rent. They get to operate and do whatever they're looking to do, whether, like I mentioned, library, cafe, concert space, whatever it may be, ends up being a community space. But then when it becomes very popular, then becomes marketable for the landlord. And we've seen very good evidence where it's actually worked. And we've seen these nonprofits actually develop long-term relationships with the landlord. So if they own other storefronts that are empty, they end up moving to those other areas where they can market that as well. Now, the other aspect too is another part of my economic plan is that's the formation of super blocks. With a lot of individuals that may not be familiar with super blocks, it's something that was created in 2016 in Barcelona. And so we have 5 years of data to really look at it. And basically what it did is it relegated all car traffic to the major thoroughways and closed off all the rest of the streets for pedestrians only. And what we've seen from that is that the increased foot traffic led to increased business activity, and those small businesses ended up hiring more people, also increasing wages. Moreover, there's been community health benefits where people are outside more and meeting their neighbors. And the other aspect is also physical health, where you're not being exposed to pollutants coming from cars or anything else as well. So though that type of plan and those type of policies would absolutely help revitalize a lot of these empty storefronts, and also build more small businesses, but create the environment for them to operate and succeed in.
New York has had recent experiences with upzoning, Flushing and Murray Hill, for example. Evidence indicates upzoning capitalizes onto increased land values. What is your view on upzoning?
So I do support upzoning, mainly because I believe it in the aspect of where we talked about in the first question about supply and demand, where we do absolutely have to meet the demand of our housing crisis. Now, the Hudson Yards project is not necessarily what I support. That is something that was not necessarily like a land giveaway as much as it wasn't focused on the needs of the city. It really was focusing on this developer high-end project that's a tourist destination, but also made for high luxury individuals and kind of the high income market. It wasn't really made for the whole city of New York, really. So there's things that we do. I do believe in upzoning, but when it comes to ownership of the land and having the ability to have a say over what gets developed, which I think it's really the underlying premise of this particular question, that's where I believe that you can invest in nonprofits like nonprofits like CLTs or community land trusts, where you have long-term residents really have a say over what gets developed in this particular land. So I called for increasing seed funding for nonprofits to $5 million a year in a budget, where last year they spent, I believe, or they earmarked around 637,000, which it should be up to like 5 million, allow long-term residents really have a say over what gets developed in this particular land. That is something that not only will, I believe, lower rent overall, but also keep long-term residents in place so they're not getting displaced through gentrification or whatever it may be. And additionally, they have more power. They really have power. They have agency. They have the ability to determine exactly what can be built in this particular land spots. And that's what I think is far more important than anything. But when it comes to the issue of upzoning, yes, I believe in upzoning anyways, just because I do believe there is a housing crisis, and I don't believe that's just facts. Let's be honest, that does exist. But now it's just a matter of like how we can do it properly, where it's actually meeting the needs of the citizens of the city, rather than really focus on some of this high-end market and high income bracket where it's not as necessary. There's no shortage of availability when it comes to high income market. It's really for the working class and middle class New Yorkers that are hurting and not finding the housing that they need.
With large development and infrastructure projects such as Hudson Yards and the Second Avenue subway extension, would you consider supporting land value capture strategies to return that land value uplift to its creators, the taxpayers?
Very good question. So I've read a lot about land value taxes. and how that will be a more fair process of assessments for the land itself underneath the buildings. And, I get that. And I respect that. I don't necessarily believe we should do it now where we are climbing out of an economic really depression for the city of New York. And we still have the highest unemployment rate since the Great Depression. We still have around 700,000 individuals are still unemployed in New York City. So I do believe that we do need to reform our property tax system, especially when it comes to homeowners in working class neighborhoods where they're assessed at a far higher rate than some of our individuals in the high income markets or high income neighborhoods. So there's those type of property assessments do need to be absolutely reconfigured and redone. Now, when it comes to actually implementing something like a land value tax, that type of thing, which I do believe would create a more fair assessment strategy when it comes to tax collections, but it's not something that I would want to implement right now, but it's something that I do believe that we should do at some point. I'd want to do it when we are actually almost at full employment, where we are running again, like almost at full speed, because I believe that assessing too many taxes at a particular point when we're climbing out of a recession actually hinders growth. And I do think that there's facts that borne that out, but I think there's ways that we could do it in a much better timeline, basically, instead of doing it now.